At 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, a schoolteacher in Hiroshima was taking attendance when the windows in her classroom turned white. She did not hear an explosion first. The light reached her before the sound did, and for a fraction of a second, the room held no shadows at all. In the minutes that followed, an estimated 70,000 people in the city were killed outright, and tens of thousands more carried injuries that doctors trained on conventional warfare had never been asked to treat. What survivors described afterward was not simply a larger bomb. It was a new category of catastrophe, one that kept killing for months, and for some, for decades. So what did it actually mean to live through it, and to keep living after? Historians have spent 8 decades reconstructing that morning from documents, interviews, and physical evidence. The clearest picture, though, comes from the small number of survivors whose accounts were documented closely enough that their stories can still be followed today by name. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima was the product of the Manhattan Project, the wartime American program that had spent roughly $2 billion developing nuclear weapons in near total secrecy. It was a uranium-based device, codenamed Little Boy, dropped from a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets. 3 days later, a second aircraft, Boxcar, carried a plutonium-based bomb, codenamed Fat Man, toward its intended target, the city of Kokura. Cloud cover over Kokura that morning obscured the aiming point, and the crew diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki, where the bomb detonated at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th. The choice of Nagasaki that day was, according to mission records later reviewed by historians, closer to a matter of weather than of strategy. The most detailed early account of what happened on the ground came from journalist John Hersey, who traveled to Hiroshima the following year and published Hiroshima in the New Yorker in August 1946. Hersey followed 6 survivors, among them a Methodist minister named Kiyoshi Tanemoto and a young clerk named Toshiko Sasaki, reconstructing their movements hour by hour from the moment of the blast. His reporting became one of the first widely read accounts to describe the bombing as something lived through, rather than something read about in a headline. 2 of the best documented individual survivors are Sunao Tsuboi, who was 20 years old and walking to class near the Hippo Center, the point on the ground directly beneath the explosion, when the bomb detonated, and Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 and trapped under a collapsed building roughly a mile and a half away. Both spent the rest of their lives giving public testimony. Tsuboi led a Hiroshima survivors organization until his death in 2021. Thurlow became a co-recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize, accepted on behalf of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. In Japanese, survivors of the 2 bombings are known as Hibakusha, and their injuries were studied for decades by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission and its successor, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, a joint American-Japanese research body created specifically to track long-term health effects. Historians still debate the precise death toll from both bombings. Record-keeping collapsed along with the cities themselves, but the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum puts the number at roughly 140,000 dead in Hiroshima and around 74,000 in Nagasaki by the end of 1945, counting both the initial blast and the months of radiation-related deaths that followed. Nagasaki, hemmed in by hills that shielded parts of the city from the blast, likely suffered a lower death toll than Hiroshima, despite Fat Man carrying roughly twice the explosive yield of Little Boy, a detail historians point to as evidence that geography, as much as bomb design, shaped who lived and who didn't. What the documentation shows is specific rather than abstract. Stone steps outside a bank near the Hiroshima Hypocenter still carry a permanent shadow, the outline of a person who had been sitting there, burned into the surface by the flash, before the person and the covering beside them were gone. Survivors described a black, oily rain that began falling roughly 20 minutes to an hour after the blast, carrying fallout and soot from citywide fires. In several documented cases, it was mistaken at the time for an oil-based attack rather than radioactive debris. Firestorms swept through the wooden buildings that made up most of both cities, and the hospitals equipped to treat burns were themselves largely destroyed. In Hiroshima, an estimated 90% of the city's doctors were killed or injured, according to figures the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum has cited. Triage took place in schoolyards and along riverbanks, with bandages, cooking oil, and whatever untrained hands were available. Among those treated in the weeks that followed was a 2-year-old named Sadako Sasaki, who appeared uninjured at the time. 10 years later, she was diagnosed with leukemia, one of the radiation-linked cancers that the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission would spend decades documenting across the survivor population. She died in 1955, and her effort to fold 1,000 paper cranes while hospitalized later became one of the most widely recognized symbols of the bombing's long aftermath. Long after visible wounds healed, many survivors developed keloid scars, thick, raised tissue that forms over burns, along with elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers that researchers would spend the rest of the 20th century trying to quantify. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission itself became a source of lasting controversy. Established by the United States in 1947, it studied thousands of survivors in detail, but under its original mandate, provided no medical treatment, a policy critics inside and outside Japan condemned for decades as using Hibakusha for research without offering them care in return. Its successor, the Radiation Effects Research Foundation, was restructured under joint U.S.-Japan control in 1975, a change historians generally credit to that sustained criticism. The episode is still cited in public health literature as a case study in the ethical obligations research institutions owe to the populations they study. The story that most complicates any simple account of survival belongs to an engineer named Tsutomu Yamaguchi. On a business trip to Hiroshima on August 6th, he was injured in the blast, spent the night in the city, and then boarded a train home to Nagasaki. He arrived in time to be caught in the second bombing 3 days later. Yamaguchi lived until 2010, and in 2009, the Japanese government formally certified him as the only person officially recognized as a survivor of both bombings, though researchers believe as many as 165 others may have experienced both blasts without ever being confirmed. His case is a reminder that surviving the instant of detonation was never the same thing as surviving the bomb. Many people who walked away from August 6th with no visible wound began showing symptoms of radiation sickness, bleeding gums, hair loss, fatigue that did not resolve in the weeks that followed, and a portion of them did not live to see the following spring. 80 years later, the number of people who can describe that morning firsthand is shrinking fast, and what they chose to do with the time they had left says something about how you might think about the story now. When Setsuko Thurlow stood on stage in Oslo in 2017 to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, she was speaking to an audience that had, statistically, never lived through a nuclear detonation, and likely never will. 9 countries currently hold nuclear arsenals, and an estimated 12,000 nuclear warheads exist worldwide today, according to figures compiled by arms control researchers, and not one of them has been used in combat since Nagasaki. That fact is not an accident. It is the product of decades of policy, diplomacy, and a body of survivor testimony that people like Thurlow, Tsuboi, and thousands of others spent their lives building, specifically so that you would not have to reconstruct what they saw from guesswork. In 2017, partly as a result of decades of Hibakusha advocacy, the United Nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which entered into force in 2021 after enough countries ratified it, though none of the 9 nuclear-armed states has signed on. You are, in a fairly direct sense, one of the people that testimony was collected for. Most of the original Hibakusha have now died of old age, rather than anything connected to the blast, and the long-running health studies that once tracked them are winding down along with the population they were built to follow. Within the next decade or two, there will likely be no one left who can answer a question about that morning from memory. What remains is the testimony itself, recorded specifically so it could outlast the people who gave it. Somewhere today, in an ordinary classroom, on an ordinary morning, a teacher is standing in front of a chalkboard, and nothing about the light coming through the windows suggests anything is about to happen. That is exactly the kind of morning it was in Hiroshima, right up until it wasn't. The reason you can read that sentence today instead of living it is that people spent the rest of their lives making sure you could.